When Japan laid the keel of Battleship No. 1 in 1937, no one outside its naval ministry even knew her name. The project was so secret that the engineers who worked on her were sworn to lifelong silence. The blueprints were destroyed after use. Foreign observers were told that the new ships were standard capital vessels under treaty limits. In truth, Japan was building the largest battleship in human history, a floating fortress that would carry the weight of an empire's ambitions. The idea of Yamato was born from fear as much as pride. After World War I, the naval treaties of Washington, 1922, and London, 1930, capped Japan's fleet at 60% of the tonnage of the US and British navies. The Japanese admirals accepted those limits publicly, but privately they resented them. To them, the West had declared that Japan would always be second class at sea. By the mid-1930s, Japan had withdrawn from the League of Nations and rejected the treaty system. In its new nationalist fervour, the Imperial Navy began to dream of ships that could defy those limits, a class so powerful that each one could destroy any opponent in a single engagement. At the Naval Technical Department in Tokyo, engineers led by Captain Kikuo Fujimoto and naval architect Keiji Fukuda began sketching something unprecedented. A battleship displacing over 70,000 tons, with armour thicker than any existing gun could penetrate, and guns larger than any armour could resist. It was a return to the old Japanese naval philosophy of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Japan believed that when war came with the United States, it would have to win a single, overwhelming victory in the Pacific before American industry could mobilize. If Japan could not build more ships, it would build better ones. Thus, the Yamato class was conceived. 2 ships, Yamato and Musashi, built in absolute secrecy, each mounting 9 18.1-inch, 460mm guns, the largest ever fitted to a warship. Each shell weighed over 1.5 tons and could hit targets 25 miles away. The ships would be clad in 16 inches of armour, capable of shrugging off anything afloat. They would be fast enough to keep up with carriers and strong enough to face an entire fleet alone. Construction began at the Kure Naval Arsenal, south of Hiroshima, in November 1937. To conceal her true scale, the Kure slipway was enclosed in massive wooden walls and tarpaulins. The workers were isolated into compartments of labour so that no one man knew the full design. Foreign diplomats visiting the area were carefully diverted away. Even from the air, the dock appeared empty. The ship's name, Yamato, carried deep symbolism. It was an ancient word for Japan itself, the great harmony of the nation. Naming a warship after the country was a statement of destiny. To the Japanese public, it represented divine protection. To the admirals, it represented the embodiment of empire. Building her was an engineering nightmare. No crane in Japan could lift her turrets, so new cranes were built. No dry dock could hold her, so Kures dock was expanded at enormous cost. Her armour plates had to be forged from experimental steel alloys. Her turbines required new factories. At a time when Japan's population still lived largely in poverty, the Yamato consumed resources that could have built 100 destroyers. As the war in China expanded, so did her myth. The Navy kept her existence classified, but rumours spread among shipyard workers about a ship so large she could be seen from the hills when the fog lifted. Locals nicknamed her the Ghost of Kure. By the time she was launched on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Japan was already at war with the United States. Thousands of workers watched as she slid into the water for the first time, her bow cutting through the bay like a steel mountain. She displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, twice the weight of the Arizona that lay burning at Pearl Harbor. At that moment, Japan believed it had achieved the impossible. a weapon so far beyond anything the Americans possessed that it could guarantee victory. In naval exercises, the Yamato's massive guns tore through targets that would have withstood smaller shells. The Navy's senior staff declared her unsinkable. But in Tokyo's growing industrial districts, some engineers already saw the flaw. The Yamato represented the old world, the age of armor and gunnery, while in the skies above, a new kind of power was emerging. The Imperial Navy's own carrier pilots had just proven that aircraft, not battleships, could decide wars. Still, Japan pressed ahead, completing her sister ship Musashi in 1942. Each cost more than an entire squadron of destroyers and drained the nation's limited steel reserves. But the admirals clung to their vision. When the inevitable clash with the US fleet came, Yamato would lead the line, invincible under her rising sun flag. No one imagined that the decisive battle she was built for would never come, and that her end would arrive not from other ships, but from the sky. When the Yamato entered service in December 1941, she was more than a warship. She was the physical embodiment of Japan's imperial dream. Her builders called her a castle of steel, and they weren't exaggerating. Nothing like her had ever been seen afloat. Fully loaded, Yamato displaced 72,800 tons, making her the heaviest and most heavily armed battleship in history. Her 9 18.1-inch, 460mm guns could fire 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles, farther than the horizon. Each gun barrel was longer than a railway car. When fired, the concussion could knock men off their feet and strip leaves from nearby trees. Her armor belt was up to 16 inches thick, enough to absorb any shell ever built. Even her deck armor was so strong that no Allied bomb could penetrate it, in theory. To the Japanese Navy, the Yamato was not just a weapon, she was a statement. Japan's leaders saw her as proof that their empire could rival any Western power technologically and spiritually. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself toured the ship and called her the pride of the empire. The ship's interior reflected that reverence. Her officers' wardroom was panelled in teak. Her corridors were lined with polished brass. She had air-conditioned cabins, a Shinto shrine for her crew, and even a garden of potted bonsai trees. Below decks, she carried enough fuel to steam 7,000 miles and food to feed her 2,700 men for weeks. But beneath the luxury lay fragility. Every ton of steel poured into Yamato had been a gamble. Japan's shipyards, already stretched to produce destroyers and carriers, struggled to maintain her massive boilers and engines. Her turbines required specialized technicians and constant maintenance. She consumed as much fuel in a single day as a destroyer squadron used in a week, a luxury Japan could scarcely afford. The Yamato's first mission was symbolic rather than strategic. She became the flagship of the combined fleet, hoisting Admiral Yamamoto's flag in February 1942. When she sailed into the inland sea under the red sun, ensign, sailors from nearby ships stood at attention on their decks. Her shadow dwarfed everything else afloat. To protect her, Japan kept her hidden. She was forbidden to enter combat where enemy aircraft might find her. No one wanted to risk the Empire's crown jewel. While other ships fought in the Coral Sea and at Midway, Yamato remained in reserve, her guns unfired, her armor untested. She was meant for the decisive battle Japan believed must one day come, a clash with the US Pacific Fleet where her massive guns would annihilate anything that dared approach. But that battle never materialized. At Midway in June 1942, Japan's carrier force was destroyed in a single afternoon. The loss of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, shattered the Kido Butai and crippled Japan's ability to project power. Suddenly, the Yamato looked like a relic of another age. Still, Japan persisted. Her sister ship Musashi was completed in August 1942, equally massive and even more lavishly armoured. The two ships were meant to operate together, leading Japan's main battle line. But as the war dragged on, they found themselves without an enemy to fight. The Americans refused to engage Japan's battleships head-on. Instead, they fought from beyond the horizon, with aircraft launched from carriers. For much of 1942 and 1943, Yamato spent her time anchored in Truk Lagoon, the great Japanese base in Micronesia, waiting for an enemy that never came. Her crew drilled endlessly, loading shells, swinging the giant guns through their arcs, practicing damage control. Every few weeks she sailed in circles to test her engines and fire her secondary batteries, and then returned to anchor. Her officers joked that she was the world's most expensive hotel. Her first combat action didn't come until December 1943, when she was hit by a torpedo from the American submarine USS Skate. The damage was minor but humiliating. The unsinkable fortress had been wounded without ever firing a shot. She limped back to Kure for repairs, where shipyard workers found her armour plates warped and seams leaking. The myth of invulnerability was already cracking. By then, American production was unstoppable. New Essex-class carriers were appearing faster than Japan could build replacement destroyers. The skies over the Pacific belonged to the US Navy, and yet the Yamato remained hidden away, too valuable to risk, too obsolete to matter. In 1944, Japan finally sent her into real battle. The Imperial Navy gathered what remained of its surface fleet for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but by then the Americans outnumbered and outgunned them. The Yamato's great guns roared a few times at distant targets, but scored no hits. The battle was decided entirely by aircraft, hundreds of them, launched from carriers she could not see. When she returned to Japan, the admirals knew it. The Yamato had no place in the modern war she had been built to win. Her era, and the entire age of the battleship, was ending. But her story was not over. A year later, she would sail one last time, on a mission that even her builders could not have imagined, a voyage that would end in fire and in legend. By 1944, Japan's empire was collapsing in slow motion. The seas it had once ruled were now corridors of fire, patrolled by American carrier groups that seemed endless. The Yamato, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now little more than a symbol, massive, magnificent, and increasingly meaningless. Her guns still worked, her engines still turned, but she was a weapon built for a kind of war that no longer existed. The skies, not the seas, now decided battles. At the start of 1944, the Yamato was assigned to defend the Philippine Sea, where Japan hoped to halt the American advance toward its southern resource territories. But when the fleets finally clashed in June, the battle unfolded far beyond her reach. American aircraft, launched from 15 carriers, swarmed through the sky and destroyed hundreds of Japanese planes before the Yamato ever sighted an enemy ship. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the combined fleet's new commander, began to realize that his greatest ship had become a floating anachronism. "She cannot fly," he lamented, "and so she cannot fight." Still, Japan held on to hope that a miracle could come from her guns. In October 1944, when American forces invaded the Philippines, the Imperial Navy gathered every remaining capital ship for one final offensive, Operation Shogo. The plan was to lure the US fleet into the Leyte Gulf, divide it, and destroy its invasion support vessels with a pincer attack. The Yamato would sail at the heart of the center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita, alongside her sister ship Musashi. For a brief moment, Japan's battleships went to sea once more, banners flying, decks gleaming under the tropical sun. The Yamato and Musashi led a column of 23 ships, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway. The sailors called it the March of Ghosts. On October 24th, the fleet entered the Sibuyan Sea. Waiting for them were hundreds of aircraft from Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 38. The Americans didn't need to fight ship to ship. They simply launched waves of torpedo bombers and dive bombers from over the horizon. The Musashi took the brunt. For hours, she endured hit after hit. American pilots counted 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before she finally capsized, her hull rising from the water like a dying whale. Over 1,000 men went down with her. The Yamato, barely touched, watched her sister ship vanish beneath the sea, proof that armour and size no longer meant survival. Admiral Kurita pressed on, shaken but determined. The next day, his force clashed with a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar. It should have been a slaughter. The Yamato's 9 great guns opened fire for the first time in her life, hurling 3,200-pound shells at the tiny Taffy 3 task group. The sea erupted in geysers, but the Americans refused to break. Their destroyers, hopelessly outgunned, charged the Japanese fleet head-on. One by one they were blown apart, but their smokescreens and torpedo runs confused Kurita's force. The battle that followed was chaotic, brutal, and surreal. The Yamato fired dozens of rounds without scoring a decisive hit. American planes returned again and again, dropping bombs and torpedoes that chipped away at the Japanese formation. In the confusion, Kurita, believing he faced a much larger fleet, ordered a retreat. When the Yamato turned north, her guns fell silent for the last time in combat. She had survived, but Japan's surface navy was finished. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, and it destroyed what remained of the Imperial Navy's power. Back in Japan, the news of Musashi's loss was censored, but whispers spread among shipyard workers and sailors. The unsinkable fortress had gone down in a single day. The myth of Japanese invincibility was over. After Leyte, the Yamato returned to the inland sea. Her decks were stripped of paint for lack of supplies. Her crew drilled without ammunition. Her boilers were rationed to save fuel. Once the pride of the empire, she was now an idle hulk, beautiful, massive, and utterly irrelevant in a war dominated by aircraft and submarines. American bombers passed overhead almost daily. Japan's industrial heart was burning. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, all flattened by B-29 raids. The Kure naval arsenal, where Yamato had been born, was now ringed with anti-aircraft guns and rubble. By early 1945, the war was lost. Yet Japan refused to surrender. When the US invaded Okinawa in April, the Imperial Navy proposed one final mission, a suicide attack that would use its last great ship as a sacrificial weapon. Admiral Semu Toyoda gave the order. The operation's name was Tengo, Heavenly Operation. The Yamato would sail south with a small escort of destroyers and light cruisers, attack the American invasion fleet, and then beach herself on Okinawa to serve as a stationary fortress. She would fight until destroyed. It was, in every sense, a death mission. The sailors who boarded her understood this. They were told to bring one-way provisions, rice, not rations, no return orders. As the ship prepared to leave port, the imperial flag was raised high on her mast for the final time. The men saluted it in silence. The last battleship ever built would now go to war not for victory, but for honour. Her voyage would last just a single day, and before it ended, the largest ship in the world would vanish beneath the waves. At dawn on April 6, 1945, the sea around Kure Naval Base was calm. The crew of the battleship Yamato, now numbering just over 3,000 men, stood at attention along her decks. The flag of the rising sun fluttered in the morning wind as a bugler sounded the call to depart. Few of the sailors would ever hear it again. The order for Operation 10 Go had come directly from Imperial headquarters. Japan's high command knew the war was already lost. American bombers ruled the skies, submarines prowled every shipping lane, and fuel was so scarce that even Yamato carried only enough for a one-way voyage. Still, the Admiralty demanded one final gesture, a symbolic act of defiance that would remind the nation of its honor. The plan was simple and suicidal. Yamato and a small escort of 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers would sail to Okinawa, attack the American invasion fleet, and then beach themselves as stationary batteries. The ship would fight until she sank, taking as many enemies with her as possible. At 3:20 a.m., Yamato's engines thundered to life, shaking the harbour. The massive hull, 863 feet of black steel, slipped into the darkness, bound for the south. Civilians on the shoreline of Yamaguchi Prefecture watched silently as her wake glowed white under the moonlight. Some wept, others saluted. Everyone knew this was the ship's funeral march. The men on board were told the truth. Captain Kosaku Ariga, her commanding officer, assembled the crew before departure. "Our country is in peril," he said quietly. "The eyes of the Emperor are upon you. Let each man do his utmost." In her magazines, Yamato carried 1,620 shells for her great guns, 1,700 anti-aircraft shells, and a few dozen torpedoes. She had no air cover. Japan's remaining aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel. Her radar was primitive and unreliable. The sea ahead was swarming with American submarines, and above them, Task Force 58, a US carrier strike group with over 400 aircraft, was already searching for her. By mid-morning on April 7th, the Americans found their target. Radar on the carrier USS Essex picked up the giant ship's movement 200 miles north of Okinawa. Within minutes, orders went out to launch the strike. Waves of aircraft, fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes took off from 11 carriers, circling into formation over the Pacific. At 12:20 p.m., the first Avengers and Helldivers appeared over the horizon. Yamato's lookouts spotted them, and the alarm klaxon howled across the decks. The crew rushed to battle stations. Her 18-inch guns could not elevate high enough to hit the aircraft, so hundreds of smaller 25mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and smoke. The first bombs fell minutes later. 2 struck near the forward turret, shattering steel plating and igniting fires. A torpedo slammed into the port side, throwing men from their feet. The ship shuddered but kept her course. Her massive hull absorbed the damage as if shrugging off the blows. For a brief moment, it seemed the myth of Yamato's invincibility might hold. Then the next wave arrived. American pilots attacked from every direction, diving low and launching torpedoes in coordinated strikes. Each plane targeted her port side to capsize her. Within half an hour, Yamato had been hit by at least 8 torpedoes and 10 bombs. Fire ripped through her decks, flooding the engine rooms and magazines. Her list increased sharply to port. Crewmen fought to keep her upright, counter-flooding compartments, but the sea was winning. At 2 p.m., a massive explosion tore through her midsection as fire reached the secondary magazines. Black smoke billowed thousands of feet into the sky. Captain Ariga, standing on the bridge, refused to abandon ship. Survivors later recalled him saluting the Emperor's portrait before being consumed by flame. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato rolled sharply to port, capsized, and then exploded in a detonation so violent it registered on seismographs hundreds of miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the air, visible from Kyushu. Of her crew of 3,056 men, only 276 survived. The rest vanished into the boiling sea. For the Americans circling above, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrible. One pilot radioed back, "She's gone. The biggest ship that ever sailed is gone." Another, less triumphant, simply said, "Poor devils." In less than 2 hours, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the greatest battleship ever built, had been erased by aircraft. The ocean boiled, the fires burned out, and then silence returned. Only oil, wreckage, and bodies remained. The loss of Yamato was more than the destruction of a ship. It was the death of an idea, the belief that willpower and craftsmanship could stand against industry and modernity. Japan's dream of decisive battle had ended not with victory, but with a column of smoke rising into the April sky. When news of her sinking reached Tokyo, it was withheld from the public for months. But among those who knew, there was no anger, only resignation. The Yamato had fulfilled her final duty, to die gloriously, as Japan itself stood on the edge of collapse. In the years after the war, divers found her remains lying upside down in 1,200 feet of water, her turrets torn away, her hull split open. Even in ruin, she was immense. Today, her wreck is a war grave, resting silently beneath the waves she once sought to rule. And so ended the era of the battleship, the dream of invincibility that began in secret and died in fire. In the Pacific, the ship that once symbolized empire was now only rust and memory. The Yamato had lived as a legend, died as a monument, and proved one final truth. In the age of the machine, no nation could build fast enough or strong enough to outlast the sky.